Silent Hill: The Short Message is one of the worst games that I've ever played in my life. To put it plainly, I really hate this game. It's worse than RE7 in my eyes. See, while I may dislike RE7 because I felt that it failed to actually go back to roots, as Capcom claimed it would, I can at least see why people enjoy that game. There's combat, there's bosses, simple puzzles, at least an attempt at a story. And before I go on to regret giving praise to a game that I otherwise dislike, at its core it is a game that features gameplay that is at least engaging. Silent Hill: The Short Message, on the other hand, is another poor attempt by Konami to capitalize on the Silent Hill franchise. Now I know what some of you might say, Silent Hill Ascension exists and that could arguably be the worst game in the franchise. What makes this game so bad? But before I get into explaining why I feel the way that I do about this game, I just want to clarify one thing. Typically, I like to start my reviews by going over the story first, then the gameplay, followed by everything else sort of in between. However, for this review, I'll be saving the story segment for last because it's delving into some sensitive topics and the developers prioritized it over the gameplay. So without any further delays, let's get into the gameplay of Silent Hill: The Short Message. Silent Hill: The Short Message is nothing but a walking simulator. Yes, you heard right, it's a walking simulator. Typically, I try to avoid these types of horror games simply because, to me, they are the bottom of the barrel in terms of horror games. And I especially felt this way when people were making claims that survival horror was back when these games were coming out left and right about 10 years ago, when the indie scene was just chock full of developers wanting to jump on the PT craze without fully understanding what Silent Hills was going to be. Which isn't really a surprise because while many people love the Silent Hill franchise, it seems that most developers that get the privilege to work on an official Silent Hill game generally failed to understand what the games were really about or what they were going to be about outside of surface level material. Look, I'm not the first person to come to that conclusion, but seeing as how people were clamoring for anything from Konami relating to Silent Hill without stopping to think that maybe, just maybe Silent Hill was better off dead while Konami still holds the rights to it, might just be better than getting a new game. At least when the franchise was dormant, you could rest easy knowing that the next entry wasn't going to be a disappointment because there would be no next entry. I don't mean to go on so much of a tangent, but when your game is called Silent Hill, and the only thing you're able to do in the game is just walk for 80% of the game, it's difficult for me to talk much about the gameplay, because the other 20% you'll either be reading notes, texting, or running away from the only enemy in the game. That's it. That's the gameplay loop. And at this point I have to ask, where are the puzzles, where's the combat, because this game is just really boring. And I also need to know who asked for this game. And before anybody says, but PT was a walking sim, why haven't you ever complained about that? And that's because PT, or Playable Teaser as it's actually called, was never a full representation of what Silent Hills was ever going to play like. You see, Silent Hills was going to have a mix of gameplay elements from both good and bad Silent Hill titles that people may have liked or potentially disliked but improved upon among original ideas from Kojima Productions. The first person aspect that was in PT was only ever meant for the indoor segments, similar to how Silent Hill For the Room, where the apartment that the main character is essentially trapped in is played in first person, but a majority of the game would be like the other games in this franchise where it would be in third person. But even if, hypothetically, Silent Hills was going to be in first person the entire game, Kojima Productions at the very least proved that they could make a game that was very interesting and engaging as a Silent Hill experience. Even if the story was some wacky Kojima schlock, they at least had the potential to deliver a decent Silent Hill game. And that's what The Short Message fails at tremendously. There's nothing engaging about this game. You read a couple of notes, you send a couple of text messages, and then you run from a monster. How is this fun? I don't even think that the game being in first person is the issue because I could at least understand and see some potential in Silent Hill trying to dabble in that, even though I'm not a fan of that perspective. The only thing that this game has going for it is its final segment where you basically have to unlock the door from Silent Hill 4 by collecting photos around a looping area in the other world. This is the only part of the game where they try to do something interesting by having you be chased the entire time, and the only way to know if you're near a photo is if your phone starts to flicker flicker in a picture. Once you collect all the photos, you can then leave, and then that's it. You basically have to go through 2 hours of this game just to open a fucking door that's a reference to a better Silent Hill game. Oh, did I forget to mention that this game can be beaten in roughly 2 hours? It'll feel like the longest 2 hours you've ever spent on a game because you don't do anything engaging. Seriously, aside from that one segment that's near the end that I mentioned earlier, there's only one other puzzle that's also near the end of the game that you have to solve by looking at the walls for numbers, and it essentially just unlocks a lock pad. Look, I'm not saying that they needed to have Silent Hill 1 levels of difficult puzzles and riddles here, but even the bare minimum would have been better than just a basic ass lock pad. The only praise that I can give this trash in terms of gameplay is that the transition to the other world is kind of cool because it looks similar to the first live action movie. Even then, that's a bit of a stretch because whenever it happened, the frame rate would drop. Normally, I don't talk about the technical aspects of games, partly because that's generally where I'm not the best person to ask about that subject, or the most knowledgeable on it, for that matter, but this game was giving me a headache while I was playing it. There's no FOV options, there's no ability to turn off the horrendous motion blur, which I think is only there to mask the unstable frame rate, of which I can't be certain of, but it feels like it's 30 FPS, or at least somewhere in between 30 and 60 FPS. Again, I'm not really knowledgeable on this front, so I'm sure there's somebody out there who could provide better information regarding that. It could also be that because there's no option to increase the sensitivity on the analog sticks that it feels that it is that way, but again, I'm not really sure myself. That's another thing that I took an issue with. It's not just the sensitivity of the camera speed, but also the general slow movement of this game. It's extremely slow because you're forced to walk at a snail's pace, with the only instance of ever being able to run is when you're in the other world while you're being chased by the only enemy in the game. Which is strange because the only quick camera option that you have is to look behind you while you're running. Now that's a mechanic that I barely had any use for. Why didn't the game just have a simple quick turn option instead? You'd think that something as basic as that would be available in something as simple as a walking simulator, but it's not. Why would I even want to or need to look behind me in a game like this when the whole point is to make sure that I can see what's in front of me when I'm running away? Maybe it would make more sense if there was more than one enemy, but even then I really wouldn't see any purpose for an otherwise useless mechanic. Maybe it was just to look at the monster that Masahiro Ito designed, which at least in that regard looks cool. If the point of these moments in the other world is to just escape, since there's no combat, then I fail to see what legitimate purpose this function lends to the player. Honestly, this game just feels like a tech demo that for some reason also felt the need to be a PSA about sensitive subject matters. Do you know what's really weird about this game is that it was also developed by a Japanese studio by the name of Hexadrive. And that's because for a while now I've said that I personally believe Silent Hill would be better in the hands of Japanese developers if they were the ones working on a new Silent Hill game over Western developers. Mostly because Silent Hill is inherently a Japanese psychological horror franchise that just so happens to be set, at least for the most part, in a fictional American town of the same name. It's for that reason that I personally believe, and still do believe, that Japanese development teams, or at least ones based in Asia, would have a far better understanding of the kind of game that a new Silent Hill should be. And it's not like this team is consistently dishing out bad games either. Aside from the fact that they worked on The Third Birthday, most of the games that they worked on have been generally received as okay. Hell, they even worked on the Not a Hero DLC for RE7, which was one of the only few things I didn't think was so bad. So it's strange that this turned out so underwhelming that it was even worse than my lowest expectations. My only guess would be that it's possible that this is what Konami wanted in an attempt to recapture what people liked about PT, but if more information comes out regarding the game's development history, there's not much else I can say regarding this. So with that in mind, why don't we talk about the soundtrack for The Short Message. Probably one of the few things that I could even praise in this game is the soundtrack. Once again, series composer Akira Yamaoka returns with some very well made tracks, which I'm honestly convinced at this point that Yamaoka could just show up to work late after getting drunk the night before, half-assing all of the music, and it would still turn out very well made. So you won't hear any complaints from me in terms of the quality of the music. Really, I'm just more disappointed by the fact that his talent was wasted on a game like this. You can have Yamaoka make the music, but does that really change the overall experience of a game like this? Likewise, the monster design was done by Masahiro Ito. Did that somehow change any negative aspect of this game. Honestly, I think if Konami really just wanted to capitalize on Silent Hill without ever making games again, they could have just hired Yamaoka to do some new renditions of familiar tracks along with some original tracks for things like the anniversary of the series and just called it a day. I don't think anyone would take so much issue in that regard because Yamaoka's work is just very unique, and generally speaking, people tend to enjoy it regardless if it's in a project that isn't so stellar, which is really unfortunate in this case because I don't hate a single track in this game. There's only about a few tracks, and one of them isn't even in the actual game as far as I can tell, but on the application icon. I'll likely be listening to this game's soundtrack in the future because I really do like the few tracks that are in there, but man, is it going to be a tough pill to swallow to know that it's for a game that I otherwise hate. Which leads me to the thing that I despise the most for this game, the story. Given that the short message's story is primarily the focus of the game, not the gameplay, it would be difficult for me to talk about it without spoiling the story. So if you're wanting to go into this story blind before hearing my thoughts, I would suggest either playing the game or watching the no commentary gameplay that I recently did, which will be linked down in the description, or you could check it out on the top right corner where the iCard is. Otherwise, be prepared for my thoughts because this is probably going to be one of the rare instances where I won't leave a timestamp on screen for you to skip any potential spoilers. Also, because I received an age restriction warning regarding my recent playthrough of the short message, I can't show scenes that essentially depict self-harm, despite nothing actually being shown to the full extent. If that's something that you're not bothered by or concerned by, and you just want to understand the full context of the story, again, you can watch the playthrough of the game, which will have those scenes shown uncensored. Anyway, the short message centers around a girl named Anita who's gone to pay her respects to her departed friend, Maya. While she approaches the memorial for Maya, a fog seems to surround Anita and cloud her vision. Sometime after, she wakes up in a room believing that she's in search of her friend Maya, who's asked to meet within the abandoned apartment complex that was known to be a popular site for graffiti artists, but also an infamous site given that there have been several self-harm incidents that occurred there. As you begin to explore the complex, you'll find various notes, which I'll get into the notes a little later because they're generally unrelated to anything regarding this franchise. You'll also find artwork that was made by Maya, which will trigger these live-action cutscenes. Initially, we see Maya as someone who seems more optimistic and curious, especially when talking about her art. Over time, however, these scenes get more grim with the way that Maya is depicted. Since these scenes are done in live action, it's very easy to notice that the actress that plays Maya is clearly speaking another language, which is then dubbed over, although the audio in these scenes isn't synced up well with the video. We're also introduced to Amelie via text. Amelie is a friend of both Anita and Maya who will contact Anita through text messages and occasionally call her. The beginning of the conversations with Amelie aren't anything significant to the story, but as we progress, Amelie will divulge more plot-related elements. Other than that, the story will solely be about these scenes with Maya. It's an otherwise on-the-nose, clustered mess that isn't really interesting to follow in the slightest. For example, after entering a room, which is the first transition to the other world, considering all the sticky notes on the walls and the fencing inside the room, you'll read a note about an increase in child abuse within the town. Anita will make a comment about how her mom, quote-unquote, loved her, which pretty much gives away that she was abused, and that she had taken antidepressants, which she claims she's had enough of. This all leads into a scene that depicts her remembering a time where she ran into the bathroom to harm herself after being yelled at by her abusive mother. Another example is when Anita has to be reminded that her friend Maya has been deceased the whole time. After she's reminded of this information, she's immediately more concerned about the amount of followers she has. This leads Anita to believe that if she imitates Maya's actions, it would bring in the same results. At one point in the game, you'll get a cutscene where Maya will just casually mention that her great-grandmother was a fortune teller and that she was treated like a prophet. So after reading some notes about the town's history regarding the belief in witches, you'll come across one that mentions that the town itself may have been placed in a curse. Anita will then believe that she's been cursed because of her wanting all of Amelie's attention by being the catalyst to Maya's bullying and eventual demise. So this time she decides that instead of imitating Maya's actions for internet clout, she decides to do it simply because she felt this was her way of taking responsibility for her selfish actions, all while letting Amelie know over the phone that she's responsible. None of that matters because all of this is just completely undone by the words, "the Silent Hill phenomenon." There was never a witch's curse, but instead a fictional mental illness that makes use of the name of the town that the franchise is based in. That was the fog from the beginning of the game, which was caused by Anita's trauma from her abusive mother. She quickly gets over it, however, when Amelie just asks her to go shopping in the end. I don't take issue with the subjects that this story tried to cover, but I do take issue with how it covers them. It feels like the writers treat these things so lighthearted without fully understanding why people do these things or how they feel both physically and mentally when struggling with their mental health. I took great offense to this story because I've personally struggled with mental health myself, and rather than it being one that was handled in a subtle and respectful manner, they just make it really on the nose whilst also making a character that was more concerned about internet clout and shopping. Something else I wasn't a big fan of was the notes. Now usually I don't spend time talking about the notes in a game, however the reason why I'm going to bring them up in this case is that most of them, aside from the ones that I mentioned that are directly tied to the story, had little to do with anything in regards to the game itself. Instead, they took the time to make mention of Chinese investment firms and COVID. Yeah, because when I think of Silent Hill, I don't think of a cult trying to birth an entity into the world. I think of China and COVID. Most of these notes don't do a good job at adding to the atmosphere and story of this game at all. The ones that do get completely undone because they just had to make a note that makes Silent Hill nothing more than a fictional mental illness. Maybe if they had leaned more into the part of the game that had to deal with the superstitious beliefs, I wouldn't take so much issue with them. Hell, even the name of the town could have been renamed to mean Silent Hill, but in German to maybe justify what is going on, but they don't even do that. This just goes to show that once again, Konami put the franchise in the hands of writers and developers that don't know the source material or how to make an interesting story based off of it. But before I go too much further into a tangent and rant about this game anymore, let's talk about whether or not it's even worth picking up. Overall, there's very little to what I can say in a positive light about this game. The soundtrack is something that I think even die-hard Silent Hill fans will likely come to appreciate, as it was done by series composer Akira Yamaoka. However, music won't carry a whole game, especially if it's not an entertaining or engaging one. I mentioned it briefly, but Masahiro Ito designed the monster for this game, and while it's not one of his best works, it certainly isn't one of his worst either in my opinion. I have to reiterate that while former members of Team Silent are involved, it doesn't shape the overall experience of this game. That's because this game sacrifices engaging gameplay to tell a story that just really fails to deliver a meaningful experience. It's nothing more than a failed attempt at trying to recapture what made PT so interesting. To add insult to injury, it's a game that forcefully makes you walk through halls at 30 FPS with motion blur and the occasional chase sequence. So is Silent Hill the short message worth picking up? Well, as mentioned before, I felt that it was one of the worst games that I ever played, so I'd say absolutely not even for free, which this game is unless you're in Germany. For some reason, this game is free in all other regions except for Germany, which requires users in that country to have a PlayStation Plus subscription to even play it, which is really ironic because the game itself takes place in Germany. But even if that stipulation wasn't there, I can't recommend this game. If anything, Konami should be paying anyone that downloaded this game because it's a waste of time. In the 2 hours that I spent walking in this game, I could have been playing a better horror game. I could have spent my time practicing in Tekken 8, but instead I chose to play this garbage hoping that maybe this wasn't going to be as bad as it looked. I expected to be disappointed, but I didn't think that the bar could get set so low in terms of lack of quality and overall enjoyment. It's just non-existent. There's no way that you can enjoy this game. Anyway, I think I've said all that I could about this game, so if you liked this video, feel free to give it a like, maybe leave a comment, and consider subscribing. Maybe next time I'll actually review a game that I enjoy playing, but until that day comes, I'll see you all in the next one. Matane.
Loneliness creeping to my skin, endless pain.